In 2017, an angler in Bournemouth had to be resuscitated after a Dover sole which he was holding up and trying to kiss squirmed down his throat. Why am I mentioning this on a channel for exploring the classical and medieval worlds? Well, this story is remarkably similar to one told by the 3rd century BC poet Leonidas of Tarentum, and our 21st century angler can add another chapter to the tale of fun modern scholarship on an excellent bit of Greek poetry. Hello, and welcome to the video. Today, we'll be looking at a short poem by the ancient Greek poet Leonidas, which tells the story of a fisherman who was choked by a wrasse slipping down his throat. His 2017 equivalent survived, happily, thanks to quick medical attention, but Leonidas's fisherman, called Parmis, was not so lucky. Just a little bit of introduction on Leonidas, then, before we look at the poem. It was from the Greek city of Taras, or Tarentum, in southern Italy. Now it's called Taranto. He lived in the early 3rd century BC, a time when Rome was beginning to extend its influence over southern Italy, and it was probably in his lifetime that the city fell to the Romans. He's known for having quite an elaborate poetic style in his presentation of mundane, or at least non-highbrow material, and we'll see that at work in a second. Anyway, this is a picture of a Dover sole, so nearly the downfall of our modern angler in Bournemouth. For Parmis, the fish was a Mediterranean rainbow wrasse, and here's what one looks like in the flesh. The poem is number 66 in the collection by Gow and Page, in the book which I've referenced in the video description. Because there are various different collections of short Greek poems, this GP after the number helps identify which number exister we're using, GP for Gow and Page. Here's the poem then, and I've tried as far as possible to keep the same content in the same lines from the original Greek, in case any of you are trying to follow along with the Greek too. Parmis, son of Callignotus, the seaside reaper, a top fisherman of wrasse and parrotfish, and the boisterously bait-grasping perch, as well as all those which have their pasture on hollow caves and seabed rocks, once lifted a rock-dwelling rainbow wrasse from his first catch from the brine, and, biting the destructive thing, he died. For darting in a slippery fashion from his hand, it went quivering into his narrow throat, and so, next to his lines and rod and hook, he gave up his breath, rolling around, fulfilling his fated threads. And the dead man's grave here was heaped up by Grippone the fisherman. It's a pretty striking poem, even if the elaborate descriptions might not be in line with modern taste. Things like seaside reaper as a way of saying fisherman may seem a little bombastic, but you can't really knock the lines about rolling around choking to death. Anyway, Gow and Page, the ones who collected and numbered these poems, also wrote a commentary on them in the 1960s, and when they come to this poem they say that it overtaxes the reader's credulity, which is a polite way of saying something like this could never happen in real life. Fast forward to 1980, and another classical scholar wrote an article with one of the best titles I've ever read in an academic journal, Man Bites Fish. Again. I've given the full reference in the video description. This article is less than half a page long, and in it the author, Combellack, mentions the poem, says that Gow and Page mocked the idea that it could be describing a real or at least believable event, and then quotes the following report from an Oregon newspaper. Boy bites fish, chokes to death, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. A 6-year-old boy tried to kill a small fish which he had caught by crushing its head with his teeth, but the fish jumped down his throat and the boy choked to death, the Daily News reported today. The government-owned newspaper said the boy, Saidi Ahmed, was a member of the Pemba tribe and lived in a village on the south coast. It said he was rushed to hospital, but was dead on arrival. And that's the end of Combellack's article. No comment or anything. He just lets the story of the Tanzanian boy speak for itself. Now we can add another example, our angler in Bournemouth. He obviously wasn't trying to bite the fish like Parmis and Saidi Ahmed, and happily he survived, but otherwise his story is the same. Now, I have a feeling that if I wrote into a classical journal with a similarly brief article just quoting from a news story about our 21st century angler, they wouldn't publish it. Oh well. But you might be wondering why it really matters anyway whether Parmis's death is believable or not. To answer this, we have to have a little bit of context about the type of poem this is. Leonidas wrote epigrams, which were short poems, originally in the archaic period, inscribed on objects. So, for example, if you dedicated a valuable object to a god in a temple, you might inscribe information on it like your name and the reason for making the offering and the name of the god, or you might get a poet to put this information into a small number of lines of verse. Another category of epigram is epitaphs, or inscriptions on tombstones. If you're interested in Greek history, you might have heard of the inscription on the tomb of Spartans who fell at Thermopylae in 480 BC. Stranger, tell the Spartans that here we lie, obeying their words. This is quoted by the historian Herodotus, and also appears in a later collection of epigrams called the Greek Anthology, where it's attributed to the poet Simonides. There are plenty of surviving examples of these inscriptions on tombstones, including the one in the background here, a late 6th century BC example from Attica. Klebelos, his father, set up this grave marker for the dead Xenophantos in return for his virtue and temperance. And this form is quite common, with the name of the deceased and the name of the person who commissioned the inscription. If you remember, we were told at the end of Leonidas' poem that someone called Grippone set up Parmis' tombstone. Incidentally, if you're following the Greek here, the 5 lines on the stone are all in the 2 lines I put in front of it. Often Greek poetry on stone would have been written continuously like this, rather than formally arranged in its lines. Also, all the long vowels have been written as short vowels. Anyway, these 2 examples are 200, 250 years older than Leonidas' poem, and in that time the genre had developed quite a bit. By the 3rd century, there are plenty of epigrams which survive on papyrus or which were later copied into medieval manuscripts that were obviously never written on an object, like this one, poem 37, in Gow Page's collection. Flee from my hut, mice, you creatures of the dark. The poverty-stricken meal tub of Leonidas doesn't know how to feed mice. The old man is sufficiently equipped if he has salt and 2 barley loaves. We have become contented with this way of life under our father's influence. Why do you mine in that nook for it, you treat lover? You won't even get a taste of my dinner's scraps. Hurry off, go to other houses, for my possessions are paltry. From those you might carry off a greater amount of food. There's no dedication or anything here, so it's hard to see what object might have been inscribed with this poem. Maybe we're meant to imagine it written on the meal tub or the wall of the house, but it's hard to see how a later epigram collector would have found it in that case for it to make its way into the Greek Anthology. As well as poems like this, there are lots of imagined epitaphs for dead poets, for example. Some dead poets have quite large numbers of these epitaphs recorded in the Greek Anthology, written by much later authors, which tells us that at least some of the epitaphs preserved in the Anthology were never really written on an actual tombstone. So then, we might want to try to work out which epitaphs in the Anthology might have been real, actually written on stone and just later copied into anthologies, and which were only ever on the page. Lots of funerary epigrams from the 3rd century BC are quite wacky. You have conversations between tombstones, the deceased, and passers-by. You have jokes about character flaws of the deceased, and so on. But it's hard to be absolutely sure that this proves the epigrams to be purely literary creations, because the seeds for some of this sort of thing are already there in some of the archaic epigrams, which definitely appeared on actual tombstones. That brings us back to our original poem. If the cause of death in the poem were absolutely beyond the realms of possibility, we could say, here's a definite example of a fictitious epitaph. This Parmis was made up to give us a dramatic poem. But we know that this death would be perfectly possible. So does that mean we can be confident that Parmis was real and actually died in this way? Well, not necessarily. It turns out that Leonidas quite enjoys a dramatic death. In another poem, he describes the death of a man cut in half by a sawfish. This is poem 65 in Gow Page's collection. We are buried both on land and at sea. This extraordinary thing is what I, Tharsis, son of Charmidos, achieved by the will of the fates. For, diving into the sea after the stuck weight of the anchor, and going down into the moist Ionian wave, I salvaged it, but I myself, turning back and coming up from the depths, already stretching my hands up to the sailors, was eaten. Such a wild and greatly large monster came for me, and feasted on everything as far as my navel. The sailors drew half of us, a cold weight, from the brine, but the sawfish broke off the other half. They buried the troubled remains of Tharsis on this shore, good sir, and we did not come back to our fatherland. If both this and poem 66 were real epitaphs, Leonidas got some pretty amazing commissions, poetically speaking. Think about the dramatic style of the poem too. The long amount of time spent building up a picture of Tharsis retrieving the anchor from the seabed, and then the dramatic "Ebrothen," I was eaten, at the start of a couplet, coming out of the blue. Also, if you go in for this sort of thing, it comes halfway through the poem, splitting it in half like Tharsis' body. Then the use of we rather than I is perfectly correct Greek, but it's tempting to think that we're listening to two speakers, the two halves of his body. Again, there's a really big delay until we get the crucial information of the actual animal involved, the sawfish, or pristis in Greek. Now, to be clear, none of this literary embellishment means that this poem definitely didn't appear on a real tombstone, but when you add it all together with the sensational nature of the death, and the fact that his fellow sailors supposedly buried him on a foreign shore, the chances do seem to get a bit slimmer. Let's look back at our original poem then. The death may be believable, but we can see some of the same literary embellishment. The big delay talking about all of the different fish Parmis was good at catching before the dramatic "he died" at the start of a couplet. Again, this isn't conclusive, but there is some really useful information in the last line. The tomb was set up, and therefore the poem was commissioned, we imagine, by a fisherman named Grippon. For one thing, we might doubt whether a fisherman could afford such an elaborate epitaph. Fishing was one of the poorest professions in the ancient Greek world. But more importantly, his name seems to be a silly pun. In Greek, it's Grippon ho Grippius. Grippius is Greek for fisherman. So Grippon, the fisherman, isn't quite Fishy McFishface, but it's not far off. It's as if his name is Fisher the fisherman. And if you type his name into the lexicon of Greek personal names, I put a link in the description, nothing comes up. The lexicon of Greek personal names is a resource which collates all the names of real Greeks which appear on inscriptions and so on. Now, obviously it might just be a coincidence that there are absolutely no surviving Grippones at all, and an inscription might be dug up tomorrow with a Grippone dedicating his rod and tackle to Poseidon, but I'm not holding my breath. And even if it is a real name, the pun here is still suspicious. Still, we can't be sure that Parmis wasn't real. Our angler from Bournemouth shows us that his death is at least believable. Personally, I think Leonidas' poem is a purely literary creation and never appeared on a tombstone, as much as this would be an amazing epitaph to read. But perhaps you disagree. Let me know in the comments. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed our brief look at some quality Greek poetry. See you next time.